Okay, yeah, well, we have a special episode of Off the Record today because, of course, it's Halloween, and also the Blue Jays could win the World Series tonight, so we'll see what happens there. But yeah, for the Halloween, I know we talked about ostriches last week, Alex, but you found this clip of an ostrich costume, which certainly had me laughing. Yeah, so I mean, some of these do-it-yourself costumes, it's like, how do people even come up with this? I don't know how that woman came up with creating the costume, because that is like, I mean, the level of creativity that goes into making something like that is something. But yeah, Alex, imagine someone shows up to your door trick or treating, and that's what you open the door to. I mean,
Oh, I'd give them real
would you
candy
give them
for
extra
sure.
candy? Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No dental floss for those kids.
Do you guys live in neighborhoods where the kids actually still trick or treat? Like, I'm disappointed. Where I live, the kids don't. They just don't trick or treat. So they obviously congregate in some other neighborhood, but mine's just not one where they come. I don't know why that is.
Yeah, I'm over here in the east side of Ottawa. It's very common where I live that kids and even teenagers are trick or treating. Normally starts with the younger ages, goes older as night matures, and it's. I think frankly it's less than in years past when I was young. When I was young, I mean, it was every house next door and in front of our house. You would have candy boxes in front of every porch. But now it's, I guess you'd say, one every two or three houses that are actually participating in giving the candy. And you have a lot of doors that are being knocked and aren't even prepared. So perhaps that might be a cultural demographic shift you're seeing. I mean, I guess Halloween is a tradition more bought into by, Canadians of a longer heritage in the country, whereas a lot of first time or first generation immigrants may not participate for different reasons, religious, cultural differences. And essentially, what I'm trying to say is that now that, we're much more we have a lot more newcomers in the neighborhood and community. We have much less participation in Halloween proportionally, although we're a larger population today for it.
Yeah, just quick before we start the show, what was your guys' favorite candy to get as kids there? Alex, you're muted.
No, I just said, oh, that's a really good question. Can't remember what my favorite candy was. I always like Campinos, but I don't see those anymore. Do you guys remember those?
Like, I have no idea what those are.
Hard candies. They were great.
What about you,
For
Walid?
me, it's got to be Kinder Bueno. It's always been my favorite chocolate. Always will be. And I think Halloween, if you're really lucky, you might get one of the small mini versions, but pretty Kinder Bueno. And maybe even like a coffee crisp as well.
Yeah, my favorite might not get enough love, surprisingly, was actually Rockets. The candy. I'm pretty sure they're like 99.9% sugar, and then the 0.01 is whatever solidifies it. But yeah, obviously we started off on a fun note here, but just hopping into the show, of course, I'm Isaac Lamoureux from True North here, joined by my colleagues Alex Zoltan and Walid Tamtam. Yeah, so as I was saying, we definitely started off on a fun note, but for our first story here, not fun at all. Alex, you've been all over this. Richmond residents potentially, and even all BC residents for that matter, potentially losing their land titles. I mean, what's going on here, Alex? It just seems too astonishing to believe.
Yeah, so this story goes back to August. Well, actually, it goes back to like 2017 or 2018. This was regarded as the longest trial in Canadian history. It had 518 days of trial court dates. And basically what it is, I actually made a map, if that's helpful. So this cost $70. I had to go to Staples. This is the disputed area, essentially, in Richmond. So I can't really show it very well on here. This isn't the best camera angle.
The map's too big.
Yeah. The map is really big. It was kind of a waste of money because when I went to the town hall, there was like 20 of these that the city had already made. But essentially, like, this area is along the northern bank of the Fraser River, and it is owned partially by the city of Richmond, partially by the government at the provincial level, but it is also owned by a lot of private homeowners. So an activist judge in Vancouver, Barbara Young, decided that this land, because the Cowichan tribes, we really want to get into the weeds on this. The reason I call them the Cowichan tribes is because it's actually like several different tribes They're the largest First Nations group in British Columbia. They had gone there to fish and also to capture slaves back in the 1850s. So she decided that their Aboriginal title was still valid. What does that mean for the people that live there? Well, that means that they now have to live under what she deems dual title, which means that you can own it privately, Isaac, or Walid, but the Cowichan tribe also owns it.
Yeah, so let's just jump into the lending process, Alex, because of course, for those who don't know, you have a background in finance, which is very useful here. And on top of that, you talked to a homeowner on the site there at one of the debates or whatever, and he had owned a house there for 50 years, I believe, but he still had a mortgage on it, so maybe he refinanced or something, or took a loan out against the house. There's plenty of reasons why he would still have a mortgage 50 years after buying the house. But yeah, is it so the lenders wouldn't? They said they're not renewing his mortgage. Like, what happens there?
It's not clear. So people asked the mayor of Richmond that exact question, and he said, well, you'll have to talk to the province. Because in Canada, land title acts, I believe, are dealt with provincially. So then I asked 3 conservative MLAs, BC conservative MLAs, who explained to me that the province has provided these people with no insight on what goes forward from here. So it's highly inconvenient timing as well, because the vast majority of Canadian mortgages are coming up for renewal this year. So
yeah, has David Eby said anything about this, or has he just been tight-lipped?
Yep, so him and Nikki Sharma, she's the Attorney General of BC, they're both seeking a stay of proceedings. So what that means, in other words, is that the ruling that Barbara Young made, that this is subject to dual title, meaning private ownership and Aboriginal title, would essentially be stayed. It would be, so that the ruling is valid, but it's not enforceable until there is an appeal. Well, that does little to nothing to assuage lenders, right? I think that it's important for people to understand that when it comes to mortgages, if the property is not, if you cannot repossess a property, then the collateral is worthless, right? So if you, for instance, Walid, if you borrow $1 million from me to purchase a factory, I can give you a lower interest rate on the assumption that if you don't pay me back for that money, I can repossess the property and therefore, make myself whole if you're a bad borrower or whatever. But in this case, I can't, because I would have to repossess it from both you and the Cowichan tribes, which would be a long, drawn-out legal process. The cost of adjudicating that would probably be more than the property is worth. So this is an utter shit show and a disaster.
So, but normally, let's say if you, I don't know, fail to pay your mortgage for X amount of time, like the bank's going to foreclose on your home. So in this case, if the bank won't lend you money for your mortgage, are they the ones who then repossess your home? Like, I just don't get what happens in the end here.
I'm not even certain they would know how to repossess the home, because they would have to repossess it from both you and the Cowichan tribes. This is completely unprecedented.
Like, is there any world where the Cowichan tribes take your house from you?
That's a really good question, actually. So the Cowichan tribes put out a statement, and my impression, and people are maybe going to accuse me of being a liberal on this one because it is a little bit subjective and whatever, but like my impression is that the Cowichan tribes asked for an inch and got a mile. Like they had no interest in taking away private property owners' property. But the judge gave them that ability anyway, because theoretically speaking, if the Cowichan tribes did want to take the property, the judge's decision almost not only allows them to, but almost implores them to, because she says that Aboriginal title supersedes, it exceeds the importance of private ownership. So the Cowichan tribes, luckily, are like pretty good actors, it would appear at this point. But that, again, does nothing to calm the concerns of lenders, who are really the important part of all of this. For people who aren't aware, like in finance and in economics generally, credit is the lifeblood of any economy. Like if you don't have credit, you have nothing. Development stops. Just everything comes to a complete standstill. And contextually, this is very relevant and important. 120% of BC's land is subject to a land claim from an Indigenous tribe. So when I heard that, I was immediately kind of skeptical. How could it be 120%? That's more land than exists. And Teresa Watt, a conservative MLA, explained to me very kindly, she says that's because there's so many overlapping claims between differing Indigenous tribes. So if you were to extrapolate this decision from the BC Supreme Court across the entire province, the whole province is, you can't touch it. It's suddenly uninvestable because we don't have private property rights. And this all comes downstream from a 2019 decision, if my memory serves me correctly, from the BC government to ratify UNDRIP as an actual policy under BC law. UNDRIP is the UN Declaration of Rights for Indigenous People. And what they say is that Indigenous people who have a claim to the land also have a right to self-determination. What does that mean? Well, it means... I'm not entirely sure, to be perfectly honest with you. Like, nobody really knows what the consequences of this ruling is. This stay, if enforceable and if it works, again, doesn't really do much because this would still have to go to the BC Court of Appeal, and they expect that case to take another 5 to 10 years. So this is just a disaster.
So should private properties in BC be immediately concerned or at least somewhat relieved that the can's being kicked down the road?
No, they should be super concerned. This is an absolute something burger. This is an absolute something burger. And I went into this town hall on Tuesday really curious if this is a nothing burger or a something burger, because it can only be one or the other, in my opinion. I thought maybe this is just kind of a symbolic land acknowledgement for the title of your home, in which case, like, really, who cares? Like, we do land acknowledgements all the time in BC. They're bullshit. We don't like them, but who cares? But in this case, this is not a nothing burger. This is a something burger because the banks cannot repossess the property, which means it's no longer lendable. The mortgages are no longer enforceable. And so I don't know what these homeowners are going to do.
Well, my thoughts are with any homeowners in BC and in Richmond specifically. And I really hope this works out in their favor. I guess it seems like we don't have a clear vision of what this is going to look like, but just hope for the best, I guess. One more question, I guess, Alex. Do you think that, and I don't know how much this has to do with provincial government, but could this have any backlash on the BC and NDP going forward, like, say, in the next provincial election? Could this be something that would potentially bring them down?
So an Angus Reid poll actually came out prior. Well, it came out yesterday, but the poll was conducted prior to this town hall meeting when we weren't really sure if it was a nothing burger or a something burger. And even amongst those 1,000 people who were surveyed before this meeting, 60% of them, so more than half, thought that this would harm rather than help reconciliation, the concept of reconciliation. And 2/3 thought that 2 out of 5 people in British Columbia thought that the province was spending too much time on reconciliation. So, of course, the Conservative Party of BC is also in shambles on their own accord. So, it result in change of government? I'm not entirely sure. But most British Columbians are pretty pissed off.
Yeah, BC politics is a nightmare right now. No one really knows what's going on, but who knows? If the Conservatives get their ducks in a row, then maybe they can make something of this. Anyways, we'll move on to something sticking with the West, sort of, but also now including the East. This was a very interesting development, let's say, over the week, where Ontario has launched a feasibility study for a potential new pipeline project that could connect Western oil with the East, because as we know, there is no cross-Canada pipeline. It's funny, I always go to the Alberta Separatist Defense, and a common hit that they have is Jeff Rath always smack-talking Doug Ford because, of course, he didn't know that his oil has to go through the United States to get to him, because he was saying, oh, we'll cut off the U.S. oil. It's like, dude, you can't do that. You can't do that. The oil you get in Eastern Canada goes through Line 45, through the U.S. Like there is no cross Canada pipeline, and of course we've been talking about this for what seems like generations because it really is a never-ending topic. This cross Canada pipeline, but this could be good because Ontario is getting involved now, and of course the premiers have been talking about this for months. The Alberta, Saskatchewan, they've all been kind of united on getting this to the forefront. They, for example, signed a memorandum of understanding in July, I think. That's Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario to strengthen energy in Canada. But this was really good. I mean, again, you have to get all premiers on board, so it feels very complicated because Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew didn't sign that memorandum of understanding. So I don't really know how they could get this done without everyone being on board, which is tough, especially because we know the federal government isn't necessarily on board yet either, because Mark Carney's first list of major projects, of course, did not include a pipeline. And Smith's been pushing for one for the next major projects list, which will be at the Grey Cup announced. And that's just for a West Coast pipeline, though. So that's between Alberta and BC. And we've seen so much back and forth on that, too, because David Eby really doesn't want to get on board with Smith there. But as for this, interestingly enough, Juno News did some exclusive polling, which found that 98.5% of Canadians support building more pipelines. So pretty much everyone wants to build more pipelines. Wow. Unsurprisingly, of course, building pipelines in Canada would do nothing but strengthen our economy, make the country richer, make every single person in the country richer, make us less reliant on the United States. I mean, I could probably talk for 5 minutes just listing the pros from this project. But yeah, I wanted to ask you guys, especially because we talk so much about Ford, do you think this is just him kind of saying something that will make his approval rise or make him liked, but not actually going to commit to anything real? Like, is it just words and all talk?
I think it has to do with what I call the early Carney days, where Carney hosted a number of First Ministers meeting, and then, of course, for Ford, that was his opportunity to expand his national coverage, frankly. I mean, if you don't know him very well from Ontario, you started to get to know Doug Ford once he attended those First Ministers meetings and went off on speeches praising Carney, rolling the red carpet, and, that fireside chat they had for hours overnight. I mean, it was just kind of a high school kind of crush situation between Carney and Ford. But I would go back to a very interesting point about the lack of the, Canada-wide pipeline or East-West pipeline in this case is, one of the greatest infrastructure symbols of nationalism or Canadian patriotism was, the railway, right? And of course, Via Rail having effectively this cross-country monopoly, they've received some funding to improve, expand, lower prices for a cross-Canada pass. This is one of the things that Carney announced over the summer in July. Speaking of July, not only did he have the July 21st deadline of getting a deal with the U.S. that he didn't meet, but he also, if you guys remember, he had a July 1st deadline of removing effectively most trade barriers between provinces, which is still something that has not been realized. And of course, I spoke to trade experts and lawyers who've covered cases like the Frida beer case, when that man from Atlantic Canada was, fined by the RCMP and got into some legal issues for simply taking a couple cases of beer across the borders of two provinces. I think in the case it was Nova Scotia and Quebec, if I remember correctly. But the barriers are still up. The lack of east-west connection vis-a-vis pipelines are not there. No projects have been approved as of yet. No shovels are digging anywhere. And we remain reliant on the U.S. not only for our energy resources out here in the east, in Ontario, where I'm located right now, but also for a lot of trade. Commercially speaking, it's coming from Michigan, a lot of commerce, not coming from Manitoba or vis-a-vis Saskatchewan and Alberta nearly as much, of course. So there was a part of Carney's agenda that was really popular and widely accepted across the population. I mean, removing interprovincial trade barriers, encouraging some sort of centralization of, or at least national standard across certain trades, so that if you're certified for certain professions then in Ontario, you could be qualified easily in Alberta and across other provinces as well. So that agenda has slowed down a lot. I would also point to David Eby. So, Doug Ford, to his credit, has spoken up. He's been in those rooms. He's engaged the conversation. Say what you want to say about Doug Ford being a liberal conservative disguise. I would say David Eby is probably the most the wrecking ball of national unity. Believe it or not, the NDP guy from out west, because, I mean, this guy, at one of those first ministers' meetings, this guy was picking up bags of chips in Tokyo, in a Tokyo supermarket where no one had any idea who the hell he was and what he was doing, recording TikTok videos with British Columbia-made chips in his hands, or nuts, or whatever the hell it was in that little plastic bag, talking about how, BC is reaching out to the Asian markets. Like, realize that they can reach out to the market next door and open up a corridor for a pipeline project that Danielle Smith has been pushing for with Indigenous support. So I think Ford is definitely speaking in better tone, better language. But at the end of the day, this is an agenda that we've kind of forgotten, because now we're thinking about this international framework of getting more deals done. Of course, Carney wants to more than double our international exports, and to his credit, he's gone around the world with very little in return. But at least he's doing the traveling. He's showing up where he has to be. But domestically here, the premiers haven't really done that much to fulfill that campaign promise of keeping Canada united, or having a one Canada model for many of our economic exchanges.
Can I jump in here very quickly? Nothing pisses me off more than this story in Canadian politics, because it exposes all of the anti-Trump politicians for the complete liars that they totally are. Mm-hmm. If Carney is accurate in saying that this is the greatest crisis since World War II, then he would be invoking the notwithstanding clause to move all of our crude oil to Tidewater. The inconvenient truth for Trump is that the United States gets more than half of its crude oil from Canada. The inconvenient truth for Canada is that 98% of our crude oil goes to the United States. So if we really wanted to fight back against the United States and Donald Trump, the only thing that we can do, our only leverage, is to export our oil elsewhere, diversify our customer base. Canada can't close off its walls to foreign trading partners. It needs to expand them. And so this is just complete nonsense, the fact that we can't build pipelines to Tidewater and export our most precious resource to other countries. That would be the best thing we can do to fight back against the United States. And nobody seems to want to do it. There's no political will. So when they say this is the greatest crisis since World War II, they're either lying and being disingenuous, or they are being genuine and they're dumb.
I'll just add one more thing on this story, because for those who don't know, I've been working at the Alberta legislature Monday to Thursday. And as I was just about to start writing this story, a spokesperson for the Ministry of Energy stopped by my office, so we got to chat a bit. And I was asking them what they thought about this kind of plan for Ontario. Of course, they were very excited. They said that the ministry did, that this could create hundreds of thousands of jobs, bring tens of billions of dollars in private investment. I mean, I already spoke about the economy, but they also told me, interestingly, that Alberta is obviously not funding the study, but they will be providing technical expertise and support, because, of course, Alberta Ministry of Energy has plenty of expertise to offer on pipelines. So, yeah, but I mean, maybe we'll never see a cross-country pipeline. Like you said, Alex, this is such a talking point for these especially these leftist politicians, but they don't actually seem to want to get anything done. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, of course, called for the 9 bad laws to be cancelled from Carney, many of which impede or completely stop pipeline development, especially from a private investment angle, and we've seen no movement on those. So it's really just a waiting process for something to actually get done. But Walid, I wanted to turn to you for the next story, because speaking of wasting money, this is ridiculous. So there were some federal research grants that are burning over $1 billion a year. What are some of these things that they're spending taxpayer money on here?
Well, it makes you scratch your head as a taxpayer, because what the hell is going on with some of these grants and some of these project ideas? I mean, first of all, let's take the dollar section off. Let's just look at this intellectually from an academic perspective. What is the value of some of these studies in terms of furthering our understanding of society? I mean, as a professor, as a researcher, as an academic, how are you building credibility beyond perhaps your own institution? I know a lot of academics, their big goal is to find their ideal dream institution, get some tenure, become a professor, perhaps even publish a book, publish reports in think tanks. I mean, you're going to have to take this beyond the walls, or what I call the ivory tower of academia, which can sometimes be a little bit silly. And I would even go as far and being generous to these academics and saying there are things that are valuable inside the social sciences and humanities that perhaps from the outside we won't value as much at certain phases. The development of thinking, understanding, diverse identities of people, demographic studies, things like that, that perhaps, face value, we don't really value very much as taxpayers. And there's a very reasonable argument to suggest that taxpayer funds shouldn't be going to it. But in these cases, you have just plain old, ridiculous nonsense with high bills of tens of thousands of Canadian taxpayer dollars. I'll give you a few examples I had in the article. There was a study about the gender politics of Peruvian rock music. Now, I don't actually listen to rock very much, but for those who do, I wonder if Peru is even a top destination of rock music. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I know it's a small Spanish-speaking country in this region where their culture isn't as high volume as perhaps in Argentina, where I think rock music is well known outside of their own borders. Why are we studying that in Canada? And that's, by the way, that's $20,000 for a study on that. We have the study that was a bit more expensive, actually, called The Rhetoric of the Selfie. $94,000. Sounds to me like a study to do more with the social understanding of selfie culture. I'm not personally interested, but here's an interesting one because we're all sitting down right now on chairs. And this is actually done here in Ottawa at Carleton University by a young researcher. It's called the Fat Chair, Thickening Design Standards Through Fat Studies. Essentially, the guy wants to look into how we can be more accessible in producing chairs by making them thicker for those that are fatter. I don't know if you guys have ever experienced breaking a chair for your weight, but it is something that some people have experienced. I'm not going to lie. Grade 6, I had a linebacker, football player, soon to become, that is now playing in the NFL, who broke a chair before. So I understand there's a certain demographic interested, but that's $58,000 charged to the taxpayers for that. And Alex, you might like this one because this one brings kind of the vibe of just pure absurdity. And I think you might be able to bring this down to earth, perhaps, if you're skilled enough to do so. But the title of the study is called "Are Kinksters Doing It Better?" ? Gaining insights on sexual well-being from kink community members. That is $73,786 of our money. Alex, what the heck is the kink community? Can you tell me more about that?
I have no clue. I know I'm the crime reporter, but I'm actually pretty vanilla. Like, I don't.
Isaac, any thoughts? Like, what are we talking about here? What is this?
Yeah, no, it's like people who like to do crazy sexual things.
Would that be like the S&M people or whatever, or the?
I mean, what I try my best when we're doing these articles for our viewership who read my articles and read the great work of Alex in crime and the great work of Isaac up from Alberta is, we are thinking critically about what exactly is going on. We're not trying to, just paint everything that's going on in a bad light or conservative or critical light. It's like pinning what is of interest to the demographic and being fair and objective. Here, I have over 24 different projects that, thanks to the Canadian Taxpayer Federation, was highlighted as being some of the most absurd examples. And of course, the total bill of at least the last 20 that I've marked down in my notes were well over $1 million. So it's a lot of money going to a lot of, I would say, unjustifiable causes for sure.
Yeah, Walid, you didn't highlight the one that I found the most interesting, which was $105,000 for a study examining the life cycle of a grocery cart. I mean, this is taxpayer money here, but at the same time, I go to the grocery stores sometimes, and I'll tell you, you pick the cart, and then you're pushing the cart, and it's just the worst cart ever. The wheels don't work. It's freaking the loudest cart. You're like, please don't look at me. It's so loud. Yeah. So I mean, hey, if they could fix that with $105,000, I mean, hey, maybe that's actually worthwhile investing.
This is my argument. I mean, this is like the kind of thing you'd expect from the private innovative sector. Like, this is like, your casual issues. This is where entrepreneurship and the value of it comes from. It's, okay, there's a problem that hasn't been addressed in this marketplace. Let's bring a solution or a new solution. Let's bring cost-effective ways to make things a bit better. In the case of carts, I know we have this issue of carts aging and breaking down. Maybe we can make ones that are just lighter, ones that are easier to control in some cases with heavy loads. Whatever it is, I feel like there's a lot of room for innovation in that marketplace. I'm not arguing against the studies in some cases being done at all. I'm just arguing for the fact that our dollars should be put in there. I know academia is really, really, really heavily publicly funded. We have very few private institutions compared to public in Canada, unlike the US and their elite academia, which receives a lot more private funding and a lot less public. But in this case, I really do think that we're getting the wrong things for the wrong dollars. And I mean, I'm just wondering, like, how do you spend $105,000 on that study in particular, on the carts? I mean, what is you just having?
Yeah, I mean, if the life cycle or the estimated remaining economic life of a grocery cart is an issue for the grocery stores, then they should be doing that study. Like,
I think Safeway could afford to spend $105,000 on a cart study.
Why would they bother?
But
I mean,
Alex,
exactly.
This reminds me of the culture we're in under this Liberal government of the last 10 years. We're in the culture of corporate subsidy. This is how it's been. When Loblaws wanted refrigerators that were, more environmentally friendly because they would, I guess, use less electricity, I guess that was the case. That's hundreds of millions of dollars from the federal government to buy fridges. And the NDP, to their credit, called it out. The Conservatives called it out. Taxpayers weren't happy about it. But that's the culture we're in. So if it's $600 million or whatever to Loblaws is a functional policy of the government, then I guess you can't be that mad about this in retrospect.
Yeah, I actually wish Chris Sims of the CTF was here, because I often bring up the project. This was municipally funded, I believe, where they set up that phone line where you could call the river. I don't know, that was like a couple $100,000 too, I think. But I mean, these are the ridiculous things they're wasting taxpayer money on, because simply put, we can see these governments don't value taxpayer money because it's not their money. So it really is that simple. And like you said, Alex, if this were a concern for any of these private industries, they would do it themselves. But honestly, they don't care. So even if you presented Safeway with this research, you think they're going to go replace all their carts? I'd say not likely. Fat chance. Yeah. So, I mean, it's crazy. But we could probably move on to our next story here, because here we're talking about taxpayer-funded investments, let's say, but now we're going to get into the Canadian Army, because we can't seem to go very long without some woke controversy from the Canadian Army. So this was Jenny Kerrigan, I think, and Bob McCann. They were talking about racial discrimination and harassment within the Canadian Army, and I mean, I've been talking about this for so long, since I've been at True North, honestly, and I don't know how the Canadian Armed Forces haven't learned. Every single year, they're facing recruitment shortages. They're complaining about that. They can't fill the vacant spots in the Army because of the woke policies they're implementing. No one wants to go work for the Army, and they keep doubling down on it instead of giving people like something to be proud of in the Canadian Armed Forces. I mean, what did you guys think of this story? It's so crazy to me that they keep doubling down on this woke initiative in the Canadian Armed Forces.
Lee, do you want to take this one?
Happy to let you start. I think I talked enough on the last segment, but
so there's racism everywhere. Sorry, like that's just the way the world is. Like you're going to find racists in every country, in every industry, and you will find, I think, in terms of large companies, some racism there as well. You can't rid the world of racism. You just can't. I mean, people make generalizations because some things are generally true, right? Some people will come up with, people are just, you can't get rid of racism. It's never going to happen. You can, Willie, I can see the wheels are turning there. I
appreciate the way you sparked the conversation, Alex, because I really think that this is a topic on its own that reflects the situation whenever we're crying racism in any institution, be it the RCMP or CAF or other government institutions, or even the private institutions, and of course our police services as well. I often think about this when I'm thinking about the issue about defunding the police and looking at the police with such a critical view. I just think the longer we create different emphasis on the importance of race, the more racism will indeed be prevalent and will become a hybrid model of reconstructing into something different. Racism 50 years ago in some contexts could look one way, and now today, present day, it looks a little bit different, and it can be mixed between different demographics in different ratios. But essentially, when we're offering such importance to this identity, it can go kind of in that, what do you call it, positive or negative orientation. It can be used to criticize someone, it can be used to promote someone. I think it's all negative because it doesn't provide the merits of the person and their value. I think it's immoral because it doesn't objectively promote the good of people being involved in a society like ours, where we're supposedly looking after merit, trying to treat everyone equally and being fair. So I think in the Canadian forces, for example, you will have part of that demographic that comes in the military that have views that can be considered racist. It can even be views that you wouldn't actually know much about or aren't very common at all in our society. I'm thinking about, like, we talked about this on different shows, but the whole sectarianism happening between Sikhs and Hindus, right? And of course, the whole Khalistan battleground happening in Canada, especially in cities like Surrey and Brampton, where there are large Indian diasporas. Well, one of the interesting things I observed is when you had police present at some of those events that got violent, you had very mixed responses and engagements by the police officers themselves, depending on what community they were engaging with because of their own background. Some officers were Sikh, some were Hindu, and the way they interacted or weren't interacting was very important because, they have some skin in the game, you could say. So essentially, Canada being a diverse society with such
Can I jump in on that for just one moment, Walid?
Please, go ahead.
So this is what I find really fascinating about this story, because if racism is still persistent in the Canadian military, despite all of our DEI initiatives, wouldn't that be a reflection point for us to say maybe these DEI initiatives aren't working? Because just because you hire more brown and black people doesn't mean that you're going to have less racism, because the idea that hiring more brown and black people will lead to less racism is predicated on the false assumption that brown and black people are not capable of being racist. And they certainly are. I mean, everybody is capable of being racist. So that should be the takeaway from, in my opinion, from the government is let's get rid of these DEI policies. They're clearly not working.
Yeah, Alex, I'll take that a step further because I've been wanting to talk about this since you guys have been going. But just to even take it wider than just the army, but let's say the Liberal government. I mean, there are so many examples. What you're doing or trying to accomplish, you're doing the complete opposite. For example, immigration. They have single-handedly made Canada anti-immigrant because they took it way too far. You're bringing in like 10%, 5 to 10% of the population per year in immigration. You're going to destroy society, and they have. Same with DEI initiatives. You're trying to combat racism with DEI initiatives, which in themselves are racist. Of course, DEI initiatives are racist. Obviously, you're hiring people based on racial attributes over others. That is racism, literally. I mean, it's insane to me. The only way, if you want to, what they're doing to combat racism is counterproductive. If you want to combat racism in the army, what you should do is emphasize meritocracy, where all that matters is how good of a soldier you are, how good of a person you are, because then race doesn't become a variable. It's not even an attribute that people are considering. So racism will go down. What they're doing is a complete, hypocritical, counterproductive. It's just insane. Anyone surely looking at it with plain sight can see.
Yeah, I think, Isaac, you're on the spot. I mean, DEI, and this is what Conservative MP Jamil Giovanni has launched a campaign called End Liberal Racism, and is actually having some meetings, I think, in Ottawa later this next month about this. And I think, DEI absolutely can be a function that can create racism. But back to Alex's point, which I think is a very interesting one for the audience to consider, is, we're all capable of racism, regardless of what our ethnic or religious or personal backgrounds are. The fact of the matter is, some of the most intense versions of racism and sectarianism that exist in the world today are very often happening between people that don't share Anglo-Saxon heritage and that don't have anything in common with the majority ethnic makeup of Canada. So that being said, when we're looking at DEI, well, you change the demographics of the armed forces to some extent, maybe not all the way, but today you have, let's say, a browner, darker, a more colorful, and this is a very woke language they'd be using, but you have a more colorful population base in terms of race under the armed forces banner. Yet you have this epidemic of some extremism, some racism, some just complete disgusting misconduct from a few members that we've talked about before, which absolutely are condemnable. But I think the evidence and the examples of racism and discrimination that could be seen in the coming years can be very different in principle. I mean, same in principle, but very different in how it looks. It doesn't necessarily have to be a kind of an anti-black from a white angle. It doesn't have to be like anti-immigrant. It could be like just plain on religious extremism or sectarianism from
That's right.
Hindu, Sikh, Jew, Muslim, whatever, on these frontiers that are taking over our conversations in media because of ongoing geopolitical conflicts in the Middle East and in India and in elsewhere that reflected in our diaspora. Those divisions that have not been healed in Canada and have not been caused in Canada, because let's remember, the conflicts exist. There's reasons why people are emotional and upset. I understand them completely, and I'm completely in sympathy with all people that have, heritage from abroad, and there's a struggle out there somewhere in the world where they're dealing with a number of issues. But when you're packing your bags, moving across the world, if you really are seeking a better life, you're going to seek a life that will dispose of those sentiments as best as you can. It doesn't mean you forget who you are. It just means, you realize you're in Canada now, and the rules of the society and the events and history is much different. So if you're importing that history or that sentiment based off that history without the history being locally present, essentially what you're doing is you're involving an unsolvable conflict into the society. Like if Canada
I
itself,
agree.
because let's see, we have like this West-East cultural divide. Between Albertans and Quebecers, there's different ideas that are in the political mainstream of both provinces: pro-oil versus anti-oil. That's a frontier of division, and that can be articulated vis-a-vis language differences and political differences. And you can have a situation where Albertans look very critically towards Quebecers and vice versa. And there you go. You have some actual Canadian sectarianism. But guess what? We're in Canada. We can actually deal with some of the underlying causes of some of these public sentiments shared between Quebecers and Albertans because we have.
I think the term racism here is a misnomer, because if you're an Indian or somebody of Indian heritage, and let's say you're a Sikh Indian, for instance, and you dislike a Hindu from India, are you racist? Well, no, not really. I mean, is Indian even a race? That's a whole other issue. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the people who are doing these DEI initiatives clearly don't know history, because if you're hiring Indians who are first-generation immigrants, with the amount of sectarian disagreements that they have in India, you are almost bound. It's almost inevitable that you are going to have more internal strife, because Hindus and Sikhs have far more conflicts, for instance, than Protestants and Catholics do today. I mean, that is ancient history now. So if you wanted to have the least racist, again, it's a misnomer, I don't think that's the best term, police force possible, you'd almost be hiring the most white police officers possible, right? Because they have the least amount of sectarian issues amongst themselves. Now, that's a bit of a generalization, of course. If you were hiring all Balkan white people, then that would not be true. But if you're hiring, mostly French or English, do you see where I'm going with this? Like,
I do. To summarize my point here is I'm talking about how do we, because here's the thing, I'm not looking at racism uniquely. I'm looking at any form of bigotry, any form of sectarian hatred between people that can cause what described balkanization. I don't want to see Canadian society balkanized to this point where we're having, ghettos of different communities separate apart. We're having instances of violence, instances of public demonstration of this hatred. It's just frankly embarrassing. But the point I was, talking about before was, when we have something happening domestically that causing frustration and strife between people, then we can actually deal with these things that are happening under our, within our borders. Essentially, the solutions can be proposed. Things can happen. The reality could change. Sentiment could change. People are becoming, like Alex said, or sorry, what Isaac said earlier. People are becoming more anti-immigrant. Well, when the government changes its policy towards immigration, or the mass migration regime, if that cools down for a period, I'm sure Canadians will rise right back up with positive sentiments towards having a more open immigration system, at least further years down the road after some significant reform, because that reform is definitely of great appetite and need for many Canadians. But just to the point again, it's when you can't control an issue within your own borders, and that issue becomes the issue of discourse within your own country, you have an uncontrollable situation that most Canadians have nothing to do with, nothing to control, and no way to influence. And so basically you're stuck in time waiting for this conflict somewhere outside of your control to be resolved. That's impossible. That's improbable. That's the perfect moral reason as to why people have to be able to let go, because they're no longer in a situation where they can be able to actually fight for anything, frankly. They've left the fight. That's the thing. The Sikhs leaving Punjab are left. They've left. They've probably put their arms down, or at the very least, they've given up on imagining that they're going to have a state anytime soon. Same thing for people in the Middle East. They've left seeking safety. They've left seeking a better opportunity because of the situation happening over there. So you don't want to be doing yourself the curse of what took you out of the first society that you were born in the first place. And that's kind of what I think, moral imperative on people coming into Canada. And from the receiving society end, I think we have to consider exactly what people's ideas and ideologies and values are as they're coming to Canada. The idea of a values test, I know it sounds a little bit draconian for some of us, libertarians, but I think very much it's something that I completely agree with, because
I agree with it as well.
You have to. Our model works voluntarily. You have to be able to get by the vibes of our values of an open, tolerant society, because our Constitution that has, or our Charter of Rights and Freedoms that has, a notwithstanding clause that can be cancelled by governments virtually any time. It's a very weak document. So if we're going to uphold our rights, it's going to be because our society buys in by and large majorities. So
I'm probably more pro-immigration than most conservatives, but I am absolutely 110% in favor of a values test. 100%. Beyond.
Yeah. I'll wrap this up with one thing, guys, on DEI, just because for anyone who knows watching the show, they might be mad if we don't mention it. But of course, we were talking about Lieutenant General Jenny Carignan here, and there is some past controversy with her, which kind of speaks to the whole woke mob mentality, the whole DEI paradigm, because yes, this person, Carignan, allegedly evacuated Peruvian rugs from a war zone that were very expensive instead of army soldiers, and then was later promoted. So that because I can't speak to why she was promoted, but all that matters is that you can put on a good face, say woke things, say, oh, we support DEI. I mean, that's really the taking it outside of the army again. That's really the liberal mindset. As long as you say those woke things, it doesn't really matter what you do, which is absolutely ridiculous when you think about it. In any sense, when DEI is involved, we just have to get back to meritocracy, in my opinion, because it is by far the best approach. My name is Isaac Lamoureux. I'd like to thank my colleagues Alex Zoltan and Walid Tamtam. Remember, everything you heard today was off the record.
You have the articles on show, by the way, during the clip, or is that going to be edited later?
They did.
Yeah, we'll probably put it in post. But this is a very interesting conversation in terms of the first story that we did, if we're going full circle. Because what I find fascinating about this Cowichan case is where it's happening. Richmond is probably the most multicultural place in the entire country, especially in terms of first generation or second generation immigrants. Tons of people came in the 70s and 80s, largely Hong Kongers, and then people from mainland China, and they took over this plot of land. So what you have here now with this Cowichan decision is two asinine UN policies combating each other in this octagon that I call Richmond. You have the asinine policy of UN mass immigration facing off against the UN policy of reconciliation. It's the classic Indian versus Indian 5-round UFC fight. It is feather versus dot. And this, to me, I find just so interesting. And one thing that I took as like a very thin silver lining from this town hall was how great Canada is. Because you had this multicultural town hall where people's properties are getting taken away. In any other country, I feel like they would have burned that place down. But in Canada, everybody was very friendly. Everybody was very polite. Like, it is such a blessing to live in a country where all of these different people can get along, can have a sense of humor about even the most humorless things possible, and that it's a safe, secure place. And I'll just leave it at that. That's all I wanted to say. Canada is the least racist country on earth, and I didn't realize that nearly as much as I did until I attended that town hall on Tuesday. We're very lucky to live here.